Okay, there you go. If everyone heard that little voice. So thank you all to everyone who has made it here. I know Adrian's joining us from driving home, so thanks for taking the time to do that. My name is Erica. I'm the communications manager at the Children's Literacy Foundation, or CLIF. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a nonprofit based in Waterbury Center, Vermont, that inspires a love of reading and writing among low-income, at-risk, and rural kids 12 and under across Vermont and New Hampshire. We've had the pleasure of working with Brett in the past in her role as a librarian in a small rural town in Vermont. And we're very glad to have her here with us this evening. So you can learn more about us at clifonline.org and our programs, but we send authors and illustrators and storytellers from throughout Vermont and New Hampshire to different spaces where kids are to get them excited about reading and writing. We give away new books and resources, so do check us out and learn a little bit more about us. And next, I will introduce Brett Ann Stanciu. A graduate of Marlborough College, Brett is a recipient of a 2020 Vermont Arts Council Creation Grant. Unstitched follows her first book, Hidden View, a novel about sugaring and marriage. She lives in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont with her family. Brett, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And I guess the very first thing I want to say, it's an incredible honor to participate in something organized by CLIF. I've been a fan of the Children's Literacy Foundation for many, many years, beginning when my children were first introduced to CLIF through the Judavine Library in Hardwick, and then as a librarian as well. And there are many, many organizations out there who do great things, but CLIF is at the very top of this in my estimation. So thank you for having me here tonight, but also thank you for the work you do, because it really does make a difference.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really do mean that. So I'm just going to briefly introduce just a little bit of the backstory about how I came to write this book, and then we can open it up for questions, and I'm happy to answer anything. So the way I came to write this book, it wasn't a book I intended originally to write. Like I wrote a novel, and I've always considered myself a fiction writer and a lover of fiction, although I've read a great deal of nonfiction. But what happened is, when there was I was working, for those of you, probably all of you have read my book, or at least read the beginning. And when I was working as a librarian, and a patron who was connected to the library, or a nearby man, committed suicide, and his death was related to opioid abuse, it really made me think hard about what my role was in the community and the attitude that I had brought towards him. But it also really made me think really hard about myself as well, and the attitude or the views that I had towards addiction. And this was really drawn to my attention when, a few months after this man's death, I hosted a public forum about opioid abuse. And this doesn't appear in the book, but this was really one of the catalysts behind it. And I held this forum in Hardwick in the town memorial building. And I invited in the usual people, the chief of police, the Hardwick Health Center staff was there, Jerry Wolberg, who appears in my book, and EMS volunteers. And I also asked a man to speak as well, who I didn't personally know, who had struggled with opioid abuse. And everybody spoke, and this man spoke last. And just kind of by chance, he ended up sitting next to Aaron Cochran, who appears in my book, who's the chief of police. And as these two men were talking, it became evident to everybody in the room that Chief Cochran was the person who had arrested this man. And he had gone to prison for over a year. I mean, this was a substantial thing in the man's life. It in part helped him to get sober, but at the same time, his first child was born while he was in prison. And it became really clear to me that he had really struggled to stay clean after he had gotten out of prison. But as he and the chief spoke to each other, at a certain point, they exchanged even a laugh. And it made me realize, here we're talking about something that has enormous power between these two men, and really about really important things, but they were starting to talk about it and talk publicly. And that's originally how I got interested in writing this book, because I began to realize that I had looked at people, particularly this man who died in connection with my library, with a real veil of stigma. And I had looked at it with this sort of generic view that this person was a problem and not really a person. And it was this conversation that made me realize what I really should be doing is really asking questions. And that's what started my journey to write this book is, what if I really tried to forget about everything I knew and instead start all over again and ask question after question after question and really try to get at the heart of what addiction is in our society. But then at the same time, to look at myself as well too and see what I hadn't acknowledged in my own self. And then once I started that, then that's how the book came from there. So that was the catalyst behind it that doesn't appear in the book. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for that. That's amazing. So yeah, we can, it's a small group right now, so we can open up to questions. Anyone who has a question, feel free to just raise your hand and unmute yourself. Hi, Belle. But before we get going, I wanted to draw our attention to one excerpt of the book. There was just one section as I was finishing this book the other day that really stuck out to me, and I think might be interesting to kind of launch part of the conversation. On page 192, right near the end, Brett writes, "As I reached out to community members and read extensively, I realized that addiction is propelled not only by the hand that lifts the drink or fills a syringe, but also by a plethora of powerful factors, including genetic composition and trauma. While addiction had always appeared to me primarily as a sad story of individual sufferers, for the first time, I began to see how addiction spreads like cancer through our society." And that stuck out to me because I think it speaks to kind of the larger global issue here that you were alluding to, that addiction isn't, singular, and it's not in a vacuum, and it doesn't, is part of our communities, and it's a community-wide, you say, cancer that spreads to the community. And I'm wondering if you, Brett, have anything to say more about that, and if anyone else has any thoughts related to that, to the idea of the addiction really taking a hold of an entire community and spreading in that way.
Sure, I'll be happy to jump in. And then actually, I'm curious to hear what other people might think about that as well too. So one of the immediate questions as I started writing about addiction comes up about disease and whether or not addiction is a disease or whether it's a behavior. And this is a really, really important question, because if it's a disease, people often look at addiction then as though someone is no longer culpable, right? That's why there's this resistance to looking at addiction as a disease. If it's just seen as bad behavior, then you can just turn around and blame people for all kinds of things who are suffering from addiction. But the more I began to look at this, and this was really, for me, was influenced by working with the women from the Harvard Health Center, I began to realize that we need to think really differently about disease, and we really need to open up our minds to what disease is. So we can look at cancer and say, nobody really blames people usually for getting cancer, although there's all kinds of multiple reasons why people get cancer, right? And one of them is cigarette smoking, right? Some of it's just random, right? Some of it's toxins in our environment. It's a very, very complicated disease. And it's the same thing with addiction. I began to realize too, that there's a real genetic component. Like, I consider myself genetically driven to be an addictive person. It runs in my family. There's no question about it. But there's a whole bunch of other societal factors that go along to push addiction as well too. So it's not so, I would encourage people not to look at disease as a reductive issue, as just either, like, you could test for it as a cold or something like that, right? But a complicated disease like addiction, it's much more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anyone else have thoughts? Duncan, did you have something to say about that?
So I work with the Children's Literacy Foundation, and we, as Erica said, our target audience is low income, at-risk, and rural kids. And we're always looking for communities and organizations that serve those kids. And right now we're working in 2 schools in Rutland. We've given them to $25,000 grants to work with the kids and support creating a culture of literacy in their schools. And one of the schools in the application said that 7 years ago, a study showed that 18% of all the kids born in the nearby hospital were born to families with opioid addiction. And those kids are now in our school. And so we are working with these kids, but a lot of those kids have, a number of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences related to that, separate from that. And it just makes things so challenging in so many different ways. And it really, a multifactorial situation, as Brett was saying. Part of it certainly is physical. Certain people just are generally predisposed to have addictive, to be addictive in certain ways. And, I broke my back years ago. I had some opioids.
Yeah.
It did nothing for me, but I could have been a different person with a different makeup, and the first pill could have set me down a path. So
Yeah.
it's a mixture of things. The other thing I'll note is that Cliff also works in a lot of prisons across New Hampshire and Vermont. We work to connect kids and their families through stories and reading. And I've met probably hundreds of inmates over the years who are in prison because of opioids and other, similar drugs. And I remember one compelling story, sitting down with a guy who was saying, a couple of years ago, I had a great job, married, house, worked construction. I'd been doing that for many years. I fell off the roof, hurt my back. I was prescribed opioids. Within 6 months, I was breaking into houses. I'm divorced, and here I am in prison. And that could happen to just about anyone. At some point, everyone, is probably prescribed something for pain, because over time you all encounter something. And for some people, it takes the first one or the first few, and you're down the path. And it's really, really, really hard to fight your way out of that. And some people do, and some people don't.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you say that, Duncan, because prior to writing this book, that's one of the things that I really didn't realize was just how addictive opioids are. I mean, just for certain people, and not for everybody, obviously, right? But just, so the Tatros, who I write about at the end of my book, their daughter was just under this spell of opioids and just could not break free, despite everything they did. And they tried so hard, and their daughter tried so hard. She couldn't get free. It was just overwhelming for her. Yeah.
Is that, I've said to our son, when he was younger, you don't even want to ever try these things, because it's like a lock and a key. And, if for most people, the key doesn't fit, but if it fits, that door is open. You can't, it's hard to close. So you don't want to find out.
Oh, well, I'm Belle McDougall, Duncan's wife, and I'm in healthcare. That was my profession. And in my experience, I dealt with a lot of patients who had mental health issues that predisposed them to leaning on opioids as a way for them to feel better about themselves and to self-medicate their anxiety issues that, evolved from bad family situations or some learning disabilities that made them feel badly about themselves, or any number of situations that they grew up with. But the whole concept of self-medication and access to drugs, and how patients, that was really the only time that they could feel good about themselves, that they could feel free of their anxiety or feel free from their pain. And our society doesn't recognize that, or doesn't encourage people. I think people seem to be talking about it more, but allowing people to be free to say, hey, I'm hurting right now, and I recognize that I'm leaning on these substances. It's really the only thing that makes me feel good about myself and who I am in this life. And I just wish that we allowed people to feel that it's okay to talk about their mental health issues.
Absolutely. Thank you
More
for that, Belle.
comfortably,
Couldn't
more
agree more.
comfortably. So,
I think that's a really important point because, I mean, this is something I heard particularly from family members, because that sort of secrecy that's often around abusing substances just feeds that beast, you
Mhm.
know, and it just, it encourages us as a society to be far less compassionate and empathetic than really we
Mhm.
should be, or that we really could be as a society. Yeah.
mhm.
To that end, I think one of the things that both sort of talking about is stigma, word that Brett used earlier, and the stigma that is around both opioid addiction as well as mental health, I think generally. But Brett, could you speak at all towards how you think we change that kind of stigma? And do you think it's talking about it and writing about it and having conversations? Or how do you think we can take steps to destigmatize addiction?
That's a really good question. I think by doing exactly what we're doing. And the hardest thing for me, one of the hardest things for me in writing this book was talking about my own struggles with addiction, which I never spoke about publicly before at all. I just never did. And I really realized when I wrote this book that I was fortunate enough to be in a position where I never had to speak about my struggles. So for me, it was a really big step to write publicly about that. And in the original draft of the book, I didn't. It was very, very obliquely mentioned. And the editor that I worked with told me that I had to put it in, that it would make a far better book. And the more I thought about it, I knew it would make a better book, but I also knew that I had to do that because I had written other people's stories and they had shared their stories with me who really were incredibly brave in sharing incredibly hard lives. Their lives were much harder than my life has ever been. And they knew that implicitly. They really understood that only by them speaking about their struggles, it helped them, but it was also a way for them to give back as well too. And I found them so amazing, these three people that I portrayed, and the Tatros as a family as well too, because for me it modeled that they had gone through terrible things, they had survived in one way or another, and they wanted to reach back and help other people survive as well too. It's all driven, all of their actions were driven completely by altruism in speaking with me. And I began to realize that, as we talked at the beginning, right, that with Megan, that we can't change the whole world, we can't change the whole globe, but maybe we can change just little steps around us, right? And if each one of us just opens up a little bit more and speaks a little more honestly, has the ability to be a little more compassionate for ourselves, but also for other people, that maybe our world will begin to shift, or that's my hope. I'd be curious to know what other people think about that too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Megan, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought the topic that you touched on about do no harm is kind of a very good foundation in that. And excuse me if I'm misremembering, in terms of helping people, not criminalizing, just making sure they survive so they can make the next step forward, just the step by step. And I thought that was really enlightening. I'm curious whether they do it here, being from Houston, obviously sometimes I can see big differences in the way that things operate in Vermont versus here. So I was, I should look into, I just thought it was like a really brilliant way to capture that first foundation in compassion, just respecting human life and giving everybody that chance that they need, because the next decision could be the right one, or the helpful one, or the healthy one, or at least turning towards that way. And going back to the part about the first question about being a cancer through society, I thought you really well articulated. There were the people that had very traumatic experiences, but you also highlighted the young man, I can't remember his name.
Sam. Yep.
That would just kind of fell into it, I believe, more casually, and
Yeah.
it shows that it's just a quicksand, and it can just pull you in so deeply, so quickly, regardless, and how equalizing that all really is. Like, every human, or many humans, could be impacted, whether either directly through this quicksand or by someone you love, or neighbor. So I thought that was really well highlighted, that it impacts all of us.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
impact ripples out, because again, in our work in prisons, we see a lot of inmates, male and female, who've gone down this path. And now many of them, their kids are in foster homes. Their kids are growing up with grandparents. They are suffering significant mental challenges and psychological challenges because of what's happened. And so it's not just one single individual, it really affects the whole community.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious, Brett, how you felt after you wrote about your addiction. Did that make you feel any different one way or the other?
Oh, yes, actually, it did. Yes. In ways I never expected. And what the biggest thing that it made me realize when I wrote this book, when I really looked hard at myself, was that I realized you never escape addiction ever, that it's never like, oh, I'm done with this and then I'll move on. Whereas before, I had thought in a much narrower way about addiction. And I think partly because I was so afraid of addiction, and there are real reasons to be afraid of addiction. And I believe I still probably am afraid of addiction on many levels. But when I really looked hard at it, I realized that I had survived it, right? But really only sort of through luck, not really through any. I mean, I had some amount of fortitude to get out of it, but I also realized that that's a profound piece of who I am, and that will never end. And so that on some level gave me the ability to speak about it, but it also made me look in a way that made me really, that wasn't necessarily joyous at all, that really made me look and see that addiction goes on and on and on. And that the only way out of it, because my addiction spread into so many people's lives, whether they were aware of it or not. And the only way for me to really acknowledge that was to really speak about it and own up to it. And I think this is a huge, what you were just talking about in terms of how it ripples out into the community. I mean, I've done so much work with schools and with kids. This is really one of the scariest lights that I see coming down the pike. I mean, we've known for years that addiction travels down through generations, but now that it's so widespread and so profound, and the drugs are so overwhelming, what's the way in which you help people snap out of that, right? Or step free on some level from that? It's a much bigger challenge. I feel the schools are in some level, so much of this work has been left to them to do. Yeah. And it's really, it's a big thing, as you know. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
One thing I'm thinking of, Brett, you mentioned at one point in the book fentanyl.
Yeah.
And I have a friend whose 20-year-old son recently died from fentanyl overdose, and the family doesn't believe that he was even aware that the substance was in what he had taken. And we're seeing that in youth in particular a lot these days, fentanyl overdose. And I was just wondering about your experience writing the book and in researching for that, what you're learning about sort of this new, more, much more potent and dangerous drugs, and how that's affecting the community.
I do write about it. I may not actually be, if there's someone else who wants to jump in who may be more familiar with this, certainly feel free to. I mean, I guess when I started writing, one of the things I realized is that addiction is so multifaceted, right? And spreads out through so many different avenues and manifests itself in so many different ways, right? And that was one of the things that was really emphasized to me through law enforcement, right? Once they got a handle on something, another substance showed up, right? But the root problem in some way or another, well, they're complicated root problems, but the root problem is really addiction, right? What about our society is really fostering this proliferation of addiction? And we often try to think of things as a reductive sort of, it's this reason or it's this reason. But the more I wrote, I began to realize that it's multiple reasons. So some of the people I write about sort of drifted into this life, right? Because they were born in families that were really marginalized to begin with, that had a lot of substance abuse, right? And really kind of without thinking about it, even by the time they were young teens, they had sort of headed down a path that was inevitably going to cause them a lot of misery, right? And those problems snowballed for them, right? But for other people like Sam, it was just kind of more happenstance, right? He was just kind of a teenager who was partying and really did get, developed a profound addiction to narcotics. Those are they're very different reasons why those people ended up in the way they did, right? Although ultimately had really difficult lives. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and one other thing I was curious about is you sort of alluded to this in one of your earlier responses too. When you mentioned that like they had it so much worse than I did, or their experience, it was more traumatic. And I'm just wondering about the idea of privilege and kind of what it seems from reading the book, like that you were very aware of that going into some of these conversations, that you had a different, set of choices or a different backstory than some of the challenges that many of these people had faced. I'm just wondering how you kind of approached that and how you were mindful of it as you wrote the book.
That's really interesting as well too. I mean, privilege again. So I sent in this draft right sometime, like I rewrote it during the first summer of the pandemic, right? And now it's come out. But part of the pandemic and has really opened up this conversation about privilege. So the pandemic has really it's put my book in an interesting light, because the pandemic really showed up all the fissures in our society, and all the broken parts of our society just have come, in my opinion, just glaringly to light, right? I mean, we could have pretended these things, or part of society could have pretended these things weren't happening. But now a lot of this is out in the open and people are talking more about privilege. I felt really when I wrote the book, I felt really mindful to try to realize that I shouldn't point fingers at people. But I also felt like privilege for me was being able to be in a position where I could really finally begin to speak about addiction. But I also began to realize that privilege is also sort of, it depends on your point of view, because Shauna Shepard, the first woman that I interviewed, she considered herself really privileged. And I thought so much about this, because she grew up in a home that in many ways had a lot less privilege than my own home that I grew up in. But yet she knew when she was lucky. She knew that she had strength. She knew her own strengths. She knew her own weaknesses. And she also knew people who had ended up dead or in much worse circumstances than her. So she really acknowledged that. And that taught me to like really stand back and think, what really is privilege, right? It's not necessarily what we think it may be. It may not necessarily be money or education or wealth, although all those things are really helpful. But part of privilege is also knowing who you are too. So it's, again, one of these complex things. Not that we should ever underestimate that people who are born into wealthier scenarios don't have advantages that other people have, right? That people who are from one race or another, we have different levels of privilege in this country. But maybe privilege is also a larger conversation too. I don't know, that was sort of how I began to look at that too. Yeah. And I think that partly goes back to this whole thing about harm reduction as well too. That for me, going through this journey made me really realize that the real essence of all this is really human dignity, right? That we can really look at another person and not see them as a problem or as a set of problems, but as a human being with dignity. And it took me a long time to realize that because I underestimated that in myself. But if you know that in yourself and you see that in yourself, then you can probably see that in another person too. And I wish that was a word that was used a lot in the 1960s with the civil rights movement. And it's a word that I hope that we can, or a sentiment I hope we can resurrect a bit, this notion of human dignity for all people, and not just look at how they fit into society, but you're a human being. I'm a human being. What's the way forward? Yeah.
Thank you for that. Do we have any questions for Brett?
Were there any things in the researching and writing of the book, Brett, that gave you some hope that we may be in some ways moving in the right direction?
Yes, and actually this is also important because I really don't want to end, although these are really, I mean, these are really difficult things to talk about. Yeah, I would say there is a lot of hope. I really do. I mean, despite the proliferation of addiction, despite how our society looks right now, I believe we're at a turning point in our society. I believe that our youth can talk about things that we never talked about. I believe that we've endured through this pandemic and that we can move forward. I have to believe that. And that there is real change. Change is possible. I've seen it happen in my life. I've seen it happen in other people's lives. And to believe that there's no hope diminishes that. I have to believe that. And it's really important, I think, to believe that, because if you look at the whole of society, it's just incredibly despairing. It can really look that, like the figure you quoted about 18% of kids in Rutland, the situations they're born in, that is incredibly discouraging. But we know that change can happen. We really do. We do see that can happen. And I really do hope it's not based on any scientific fact. It's only based on experience, that I've had the experience that it can change. Yeah.
And I think the accessibility of opioids it's becoming more difficult to get them easily.
Oh,
For
yeah.
example, my sister was visiting recently, and her husband, for some medical reasons, had been prescribed opioids. And after a short period of time, he went back to the doctor to get it refilled, and the doctor said, "No way.
Yeah.
No, you've had enough. We got to
Yeah.
figure out a different way." And probably not too many years ago, they would have said, "Sure, how much do you need? We'll give you
Yeah.
6 months."
Yeah.
So I think that's an improvement. And I think a lot of medical providers, and Belle, you can correct me if otherwise, but they really are trying to track who is prescribing them, who's getting them. You know, it's not easy to doctor shop anymore.
Yeah.
So that's encouraging too, I think.
Mhm.
Would you say the same thing, Belle? I'd be curious to.
Yeah, in my experience, everything tightened up a lot.
Yeah.
With the electronic medical record, I could go in very easily and see when their last prescriptions were filled. And so that was helpful in that way. I mean, you can get these drugs on the street
I know.
anytime you want.
Yeah.
So they're very accessible, but they're also more expensive because the supply is probably, even though it's accessible, the supply from doctors is less.
Yeah.
And so the prices have gone up.
Yeah.
The street value, I think, of some of these Percocet and oxycodone and fentanyl, and that's gone up. And that was one of the reasons why it was upsetting that heroin pricing was going down.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was just thinking back to a situation I found myself in when a patient came in who was referred to our practice for a joint replacement. And it was awkward because objectively, I felt she was not a candidate for joint replacement therapy based on my exam, but also because of the medication that she was on. She was on, she had previous history on her chart that were red flags. And it really was a situation that had to get under control from her primary care doctors and other healthcare and mental health care workers before really she would be a candidate even to go through joint surgery, because her pain tolerance was so up, the balance of normal, pain tolerance was so out of whack that it would have been a risk for us to try to manage her pain. And I got reprimanded by, with that assessment, I got reprimanded by the patient's, she was there at the evaluation as an advocate, as a social worker, who was this patient was one of her clients. And so she was in the room. And because of my kind of objective analysis of the situation, she filed a complaint with the Board of Medical Practice saying that I wasn't being compassionate about this.
Oh.
And, in my response to the medical practice board, I said, no, actually, you have to understand, I'm being as objective as possible, dealing with this situation. And for the very reason that I don't want this person to get into more trouble with her drug abuse history.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of an interesting twist to it. I felt like I was trying to make the most responsible decision that I could. But the woman who was her advocate felt that I was being not compassionate. So there are, I guess what I would say is there are lots of extenuating circumstances and things that are difficult to manage in these situations that are very nuanced, and you don't know patients' social situations, and you don't know how well their network of follow-up will be, and if they'll get lost. And it's very complicated.
Yeah.
Each patient is unique, and each situation deserves a lot of support, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's a really good way of phrasing it, actually. That's actually a really good way. So then you're not just looking at an isolated person, but also how the person fits into the whole context.
Yeah. It's and that's where the empathy piece comes in. So the best thing would be to be sure that you're trying to find the best follow-up, the best support, the best way to help that person. And sometimes it's by being objective and potentially appearing like you don't care, but it's actually the opposite. You do care, so you're trying to be objective.
Yes. I think sometimes we mistake compassion for being soft-hearted, and very frequently that's not what that means.
Yeah.
By any means. Yeah.
We have experienced addiction firsthand with one of our best friends whose daughter is an addict.
Yeah.
And so we've been seeing a lot of the circumstances that the family has been going through, and it's extremely heartbreaking. And as a friend, you try to figure out how to compassionately help them through it.
Yeah.
And, we've done all sorts of different things, whether it's helping to wire money to the daughter, because the mother is unable to wire the money directly, or checking in on the house when they're away to make sure that the daughter didn't come and break into the house, which had been done but previously.
Yeah.
Going to see her daughter when her knee was infected after a car accident, and calling colleagues in the emergency department, letting them know that she's coming with an infected knee and that she's an addict, and having, to make them aware that these situations, this is coming to them.
Yeah.
Extenuating situations that you just can't even believe what happens.
Yeah.
And it's been a real eye opener, and you realize how stressful it is on the family and on the parents, and what they go through, and the depths that they will go to try to help their children. And it's been really, really sad, but hopeful too. I mean, the gal went to the depths of of maybe her rock bottom, and went to jail,
Yeah.
and was in jail for 18 months. And now she's out, and she's on probation, and she's doing better. And she is on what's the medication?
Suboxone or
It's not Suboxone. I think she had been on Suboxone, but it's
Methadone.
methadone.
Yeah.
And then the next step is, what will happen when she's off, she's not in parole anymore, and she's not being asked to follow up and being watched carefully. What will happen? And the family, of course, is anxious because they don't know what the next step will be. She's doing well, but what will the next step be?
Yeah.
And how will she function in the world, when it's just a difficult world for everybody? It's very nuanced. It's very intolerant. It's very, very difficult.
My heart really goes out to this family. Really, and this is obviously also a very long journey too. It sounds like.
Since the child is 28, and it's been since she was age 16.
Yeah, that's a long time. I will also say, while the world is really hard now for everybody, it's really hard for certain groups of people. And if you're struggling with a substance abuse problem, it's a really hard time for you. I mean, it's just all the things that you would naturally need, a community around you. I mean, they're infinitely more complicated, as you know. I mean, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I really do feel for your family. That is a terrible position to be stuck in. Yeah. I wish them well. Yeah.
I don't know what the outcome will be, but we'll be here for her, for whatever they need, as best we can.
Yeah. And that's all you can do on some level. I mean, don't underestimate your friendship by any means. That's it. It's more valuable than anything else. Yeah.
Have you gotten feedback, comments, letters from readers of your book? And if so, has there been anything that surprised you?
I've gotten actually Facebook messages, letters, emails. I think what surprises me more than anything else, and it shouldn't, is just the level of heartfeltness, and the level of need for people to have their situation just listened to and acknowledged. I really think that we so underestimate that listening is really, really important. And Yeah. Yes, I have. I've heard a lot of and all the stories I've heard are heartbreaking. Some of them are very positive now, but listening is huge. It's really, if there's one thing I would have done differently, I mean, I would have done many things differently in my life, but one thing I always encourage people to do, I essentially got sober on my own. Don't try that. Reach out and get help. And I would encourage anybody in a family to do the same thing. Reach out and ask for help. And that was part of my need to really write about stigma as well, too. I never did because I was ashamed and I didn't want to have that part of my life revealed. I would have done anything not to talk about that. But in retrospect, it would have been so much better for me and for my family if I had just had the courage to say, I really need help right now. I really, really need help. I really encourage people to do that because it's much more helpful. And in the long run, it's a stronger process as well, too. Yeah. And the other thing I really encourage people to realize is addiction makes everybody feel isolated, and particularly in this time when everybody feels isolated anyway. But we're not as isolated as we think we are. And when we reach out to other people, it does lessen that painfulness of being isolated. And it seems like that's a minor thing, but it's not. It's a big thing. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
I think it's a fundamental human need to have someone listen to you.
Yeah.
I think there are so many people who go through life and people sort of look past them, look over them,
Yeah.
and no one really looks at them and
Yeah.
talks to them.
Yeah.
And I think people just need to be heard. And a lot of people,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
in this time with COVID, it's hard to get heard. But for a lot of people, they're not seen, they're not heard. And that's really hard.
It is really hard. And really just these little bits of things sometimes just go a really long way. I mean, yeah. Yeah.
Well, do we have other questions for Brett? One more thing I just wanted to say, Brett, is reading the book, I was struck not only by the compassion with which you approached your subjects and this topic, but also by your storytelling ability and the wonderful level of detail that you had, particularly in place. In the setting, I felt was almost meditative in some ways. The level of detail that you gave us, I thought was really vivid and beautiful. So I just wanted to thank you for your drawing of what is an important story, and you're doing it in such a compelling and compassionate way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's another whole part of the book that I feel like is also a love letter to Vermont too. I love living in Vermont. I am so appreciative of it, and even more appreciative of it now. The world we live in, Vermont can be very harsh to live in. And that's the small town thing again. It can be lovely, but it can be harsh. But I really, really appreciate living in Vermont. It's a good place to be. Yeah.
I think that comes through in the book, and I feel similarly. Do we have any final comments?
Yeah, you mentioned that a lot of the comments and feedback, I thought that was a good question by Duncan, that people had come to you with after reading the book, and a lot of it was full of heartfeltness. You used that word. And I think that that's really reflective of the disposition and the message of the book. It just felt that you were very earnest and like people could be listened to, and this was the path, and like the conclusion was human dignity. And I think that, hopefully those messages are just mirroring back what I think that you expressed very warmly and with determination, and in a very difficult subject.
Thank you. Thank you. The hardest letters that I get, or actually, oddly enough, more Facebook messages than anything else, are actually from parents who have lost their children. And those for me are the really hardest ones. I mean, I'm a mother myself, and they're for me are really devastating. And particularly for parents, just listening and just saying, of course you love your child is a big it's just one little thing that we can do that maybe will ease someone else's pain. And it's not a lie, it's true. It's okay to love someone even when they're struggling, you know. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Brett, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. I really appreciate this conversation and you, starting this conversation around the state. So thank you for that work that you're doing, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your questions and your stories. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you,
Ciao,
Brett.
Brett.
Thanks.
Thank you.